Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, let's understand what is Spring Boot. Well, before understanding about Spring Boot, let's first understand what is the problem using Spring Framework and what problem the Spring Boot addresses. Okay, well, first we can see what is Spring Framework. So, Spring is a very popular Java framework for building web and enterprise application. Spring is very popular for several reasons. So dependency injection, easy to use but powerful database transaction management capabilities, good integration with other Java frameworks like JPA, Hibernate, and WebMVC framework for building web application. So Spring framework is used to do these things. So what is the problem in Spring framework? Basically, Spring based application have a lot of configuration. So for example, when we develop Spring MVC web application using Spring MVC, then we need to configure component scan, dispatcher servlet, view reserver, web charts for delivering static content, among other things. And then when we use Hibernate or JPA in the same Spring MVC application, then we would need to configure data source, entity manager factory, session factory, transaction manager, among other things. And when you use cast a message queue, no SQL in the Spring MVC application, then we need to configure catch configuration, message queue configuration, no SQL database configuration. So these are the major problem while using Spring based application. One more major problem, we need to maintain all integration of different jar dependencies and its compatible versions. So what is the solution? Spring Boot is the solution for this. Spring Boot automatically configure the configurations based on jar dependencies that we add to our project. So Spring Boot is nothing, yeah, advanced model of Spring framework. The main goal of Spring Boot is to quickly create Spring based application without requiring developers to write the same boilerplate configuration again and again. Like I said, so earlier, the while using Spring framework, they use it to configure these things like component scan, dispatcher servlet for developing Spring MVC web application, and they need to configure data source, entity manager factory, and transaction manager for integrating with the Hibernate or JPA in, and they need to do the catch configuration, message queue configuration, and no SQL database configuration when they were using message queue, catch, and no SQL in the MVC application. So instead of doing these configuration individually, the Spring Boot is the smartest way. We don't need to write the same boilerplate configuration again and again. I hope you guys understand. So the Spring Boot is a only solution for this, and Spring Boot automatically configures the configuration based on the jar dependencies that we add to our project. Coming to Spring Boot starters. So Spring Boot have few things which I listed here. In Spring Boot, there are Spring Boot starters, Spring Boot auto configuration, externalized configuration, Spring Boot actuator, and Spring Boot is easy to use embedded servlet container support. You can see the example of Spring Boot starters. So these starters are pre-configured with most commonly used library dependencies. So you don't have to search for the compatible library versions and configure them manually. So as I said earlier, you no need to configure them individually. it is pre-configured. What you need to do is just you need to add the dependency in the pom.xml. For example, we can see when we add Spring Boot starter web dependency, it will by default pull all the commonly used libraries while developing Spring MVC application. So we no need to add or configure any kind of these libraries used for Spring application. So by adding this dependency, it will automatically by default it will pull all these libraries such as Spring Web MVC, Jackson JSON, Validation API, and Tomcat Server. So we need no need to configure each individually. It will by default pull those libraries. And one more example, if we use the Spring Boot starter data JPA, it will pull the libraries required for Spring Data JPA along with Hibernate library dependencies, which is most commonly used for JPA implementation. So here this dependency, Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency, which reduced the above work. Like when we use Hibernate JPA in the same Spring MVC application, we need to configure the below things: data source, entity manager, factory, transaction manager, among other things. Though you need to integrate and configure these things individually. But now what you need to do, you just need to do is just you need to add Spring Boot starter JPA data JPA dependency in the POM file, and just you need to build the application. It will auto configure, like it will be pre-configured. So Spring Boot auto configuration, Spring Boot auto configuration attempts to automatically configure Spring application based on the jar dependencies that you have added to the project. Like example, if you add Spring Boot started web jar dependency to your Spring Boot application, the Spring Boot assumes that you are trying to build a Spring MVC based web application, and what it will do, it will automatically tries to register Spring Beans such as dispatcher servlet and view resolver if it is not already registered. So it will assume and it will automatically tries to register the Spring Beans. Okay, got it. So if you add Spring Boot, it is one more example. If you add Spring Boot starter data JPS dependency, then it assumes that you are trying to use Hibernate to develop DAO layer. So Spring Boot automatically register the Spring Beans such as data source, entity manager, and transaction manager. Spring Boot auto configuration attempts to automatically configure the Spring application based on the jar dependencies that you have added to the project. And going forward in this tutorial, we are going to see the REST controller annotations and the mappings, post, get, patch, delete, put, everything. So these things we are going to see in the upcoming videos. Like I will give some heads up. At get mapping is a annotation used in Spring Boot instead of the request method dot get. So for get method we can use at get mapping, and for post method we can use at post mapping, and for put method we can use at put mapping, and for delete method we can use at delete mapping, and for patch method we can use at patch mapping annotations. So these are the HTTP method shortcut for request mapping annotation. Okay, got it. So going forward we can see uh, those things. Thank you guys, bye.